Hello. Today is Wednesday, July 15th, 2015, and we're here today. I'm here with Mary Lucero in Las Cruces, New Mexico, or Vado, New Mexico, and Ray Audette in Dallas, Texas. I'm Suzanne Ricketts of Beyond and Back. Mary Lucero is with Endophyte Enterprises, and Ray Audette is the author of Neanderthin and a longtime paleo advocate. We're really happy to have Ray here and honored to be with him. The topic today is ketosis, and Ray has been a pioneer in researching, defining, and practicing the paleo diet for about 30 years now.
Yes, I've been eating a paleo diet for 30 years. I published my book Neanderthin 20 years ago, and for the first 5 years that Neanderthin was in print, it was the only paleo diet book in print.
Yep. Okay. And welcome, Ray. Glad to have you here.
It's good to be here. Very nice to be here.
And I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about what ketosis is.
Well, ketosis, in mammals, we have two ways of getting our energy to our cells. One is via absorbing it through glucose, and the other is absorbing it through ketones. And the body switches between these two ways of absorbing energy. For instance, during the day, you're eating carbohydrates or protein, and that breaks down into glucose, and that provides the energy that you need to get through the day. As you go to bed at night, you're not taking in any more glucose, any more carbohydrate. So in the morning when you wake up, you're in ketosis. You can smell acetone on your breath. You're deriving energy from your fat rather than from sugar.
Okay. Okay. And so what is a ketogenic diet?
A ketogenic diet is where you eat enough fatty material and zero carbohydrates so that your body is deriving its energy principally through ketosis and no longer using glucogenesis to derive energy. Now, you're always going to have a certain amount of glucose, enough to work your muscles and your brain no matter what you do, because you will produce glucose from protein if need be, but only enough to keep you going. The rest of your energy, your endurance, will come from burning fat. And really, anytime that you're losing weight, you're in ketosis, because in the process of burning fat, you will go into ketosis.
Okay. So I know that not just everybody is in ketosis all the time.
No, it varies considerably. In fact, in primates, they've done studies. Dr. Knott did a field study of orangutans for a couple of years. She's an interesting character. She was following orangutans through the forest, much like Jane Goodall followed the chimpanzees in Africa. Well, Dr. Knott was following orangutans, and while she was doing this and observing them, they took great delight in peeing on her. You could almost hear them giggling while they did it. So being a good scientist, when life gives you lemons, and she made lemonade out of it by taking along an upside-down umbrella and collecting the urine, and then doing chemical analysis of the urine. And what she found out was that for a substantial part of every year, all of the orangutans went into ketosis. This was that part of the year, the dry season, when there was no fruit available in the rainforest. And the orangutans only had carnivorous vegetable material and fatty insect grubs and small animals to eat. And they would go into, and fatty nuts, and then they would go into what's called the ketogenic state. And she tested this for quite a while, and she found out the ones that were deepest in ketosis were pregnant and lactating females. Now, Dr. Knott's research has since been carried into zoos in the United States and Europe. So now that all of the zoo animals, well, the ones that are the more enlightened zookeepers anyway, are being fed a similar diet so that this natural pattern will be repeated in them. And of course, they're eating just as many calories as they were before, but the overweight gorillas and chimpanzees are now losing weight and getting back to their normal state.
And so from a human perspective, how would we do that?
Well, all you have to do is just eat a lot of fatty meat, primarily. A lot of people will do it with coconut oil or even cannabis oil. Olive oil, coconut oil, cannabis oil is very popular for it right now. All of those will put you into ketosis as long as you derive. Generally, to get into a deep state of ketosis, we're talking 80% of calories from fat. Now, if you're not eating vegetable materials at all, you have to eat at least 65% of your calories for fat to avoid protein toxicity. In the process of converting protein into glucose, you generate toxic materials. And in order to avoid that when you're eating, for instance, an all-meat diet, 65% of your calories have to come from fat. But that's not enough to put you in ketosis. To go into ketosis, you have to up the amount of fat. Now, there are lots of easy ways to do it. You can eat a lot of fatty nuts, supplement with coconut oil, put lard on extra lard in your food. Eat pemmican. There's lots of ways to do it. It has a lot of beneficial results, though. Back in the early part of the 20th century, the early 1900s, doctors noticed that if you starved people with epilepsy, their seizures went away, sometimes permanently. And this led them to start testing these people's blood, and they realized that starvation put people into ketosis. So starting in around 1911, they started taking epileptics, and rather than starving them, the starvation method dated all the way back to the ancient Greeks. They've been doing this for thousands of years for epileptics, all the way back to the early Greek physicians. But they discovered that the thing that was actually accomplishing their goals of reducing epileptic seizures was ketosis. So they found that by putting people on an 80% fat diet, epileptic seizures went away. Now, it wasn't until very, very recently that we discovered why this was. Meanwhile, in the 1930s, they also discovered that if you put people with mental illness on a ketogenic diet, their mental illness went away. And if you took, of course, if you put people on cancer in a ketogenic diet, their tumors shrunk. Now, all of these benefits are very easy to obtain. A ketogenic diet works this way because there are certain cells that, unlike other primates and mammal cells, cannot exist on ketones. Some cells can only absorb their energy from sugars, from glucose. And those include a type of protozoa called Toxoplasma gondii. Toxoplasma gondii is a protozoa. It's a parasite. And it's now known to be the cause of juvenile epilepsy, autism, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and several types of brain cancer, all of which go away when you put the victim in ketosis.
You know, Ray, this is exciting to me because as I look back to, you're talking about publishing your book 20 years ago. And at that time, I was studying biochemistry and learning all these metabolic pathways. And glycolysis was presented as the predominant way that mammals derive their energy. And like you say, ketosis was noted and recognized as a condition associated with starvation. But what I'm hearing from you is not necessarily starvation, but simply carbohydrate limitations is what induces the...
Right, we've all heard the term make hay while the sun shines. Make hay while the sunshine applies here. Like all carbohydrates, it only occurs during certain seasons. So fruit only occurs in certain seasons. High carbohydrate foods only occur in certain seasons. And in all primate species, this occurs in every environment. And by our bodies being capable of taking energy from either source, it gives us a much broader range in the foods that we can eat, a broader range of things that we can derive energy from. It's a very useful thing evolutionarily. And like I said, there are a couple of systems where there are a couple types of cells that don't do ketogenesis, that cannot derive energy from ketones. One of them is the larva of Toxoplasma gondii. And this brain parasite is what causes juvenile epilepsy, autism, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and several types of brain cancer. Now, when I mention cancer, of course, cancer cells are also a type of cell that cannot derive energy from ketones. In fact, in 1931, they gave Otto Warburg the Nobel Prize for discovering that if it can survive ketosis, it's not cancer. He discovered that cancer cells cannot live on ketones. And of course, that led to the fact that if you want to get rid of cancer, go into ketosis. That seems a logical step to me, although clinical trials on a ketogenic cancer diet didn't really start until 2012. So far, they've been showing very, very positive results.
So what are they seeing with these ketogenic diets and cancer in clinical trials?
Well, usually what it turns out to be is mostly a high-protein diet, a very low-carbohydrate diet that's supplemented with some sort of fat. Usually they're using vegetable oils like coconut oil. Although, like I said, there have been a lot of people who have been getting very good results, especially with epilepsy and using cannabis oil. So, you know, but I don't think the type of fat that you use really matters. They've been using a lot of vegetable oil because animal fats have been so villainized over the last few decades. And that's why they went to the coconut oil and the flax oil and the other things they've been using. Although personally, if I was to go into, when I go into a ketogenic state, I usually use animal fats. Animal fats, it turns out, are much higher in antioxidants. So you look at it, say an animal fat like lard. Lard is 70% by calories oleic acid. Oleic acid is probably the most powerful antioxidant that human beings consume, which is probably leads to the reason why, well, they did a couple of studies at the University of Georgia Medical School about the dietary habits of people who live to be 100. And they did it twice, first United States only, and the second time worldwide, because they didn't believe it the first time. But it turns out that the only thing that 100-year-olds do differently as far as diet goes is that they eat considerably more animal fat than does the average person.
Now that throws a lot of things we've been taught upside down.
Well, it also explains a lot of mathematics, because if you look at the increase in life expectancy started increasing in the 1850s in the Western, what we call the civilized world, in the 1850s, and started to increase at a fairly regular pace until the turn of the 20th century, when the delta changed, that the rate of change actually increased. They started living longer faster. Now, the first start of the increase corresponded to the invention of the railroad. And then around the start of the 20th century, we got refrigeration. The railroad brought in pigs from the Midwest and cows from Texas to the major population centers. Refrigeration put a chicken in every pot. And lifespan increased in mathematical lockstep with the increase in animal fat consumption. Of course, along about the same time, in the early 1900s, someone decided that they could make cottonseed oil edible. and they invented margarine. So what was a waste product of cotton production can now be eaten by poor people.
And of course, this would change the whole dynamic of life expectancy and how we respond to diet. Because right about the same time, we also saw things like saccharin being developed as a sweetener. We started seeing a lot of artificial chemistry being...
Right, especially when it comes to sweeteners, because what it turns out is that people become fat not because of calories. People become fat because of insulin. And it turns out that artificial sweeteners actually increase insulin production. There's a stronger insulin response from artificial sweeteners than there is from sugar. I remember a couple of years ago there was a big brouhaha about how people on artificially sweetened soda pops gained 4 times the weight of people drinking sugar soda pops. For that reason. It's the insulin response, not the calories.
So I think you said earlier, did you say like up to 80% of the calories out of fat?
Yeah, if you want to go into deep ketosis, you would get up to 80% of your calories from fat. Now that sounds difficult to do, but if you look at, well, pemmican is more than 80% calories from fat. And a lot of fattier nuts, macadamias, walnuts, are very high in fat. They're about 60, 70% fat by calories.
Tell us about pemmican. That's not a common staple in most people's diet.
Pemmican is an ancient travel food invented by the Cree Indians several thousand years ago. Essentially, you dry meat without cooking it. So you dehydrate raw red meat, and then you grind it up with some rocks, or I use a machine, but don't tell anyone. You grind it up, and then you soak it in tallow. Now, bacteria and yeast cannot grow in tallow. Tallow is beef fat with the water taken out of it. It's as hard as candle wax. In fact, people dip candles with it. So you take this ground up raw dehydrated meat and soak it in tallow. And the tallow prevents it from mold growing on it, or from bacterial growth from going on in it. In fact, pemmican, once you've made it, will keep for at least 100 years without refrigeration.
Now, how has that been demonstrated?
They found some pemmican in Canada that was put up by some voyageurs more than 100 years before. And of course, the people that found it tried it. It was just like it put down yesterday. Pemmican, by the way, tastes like, if you can imagine, beef jerky pate.
Okay. And yeah, you've almost described, I mean, we make jerky all the time. We slice the meat thin, I like to put some green chili on it and salt and pepper. We hang it up.
If you make jerky, the thing you'll find is that most people cure it with sugar. The sugar keeps bacteria from growing on it. If you don't cure jerky and just leave it out, it will absorb water from the air and grow mold.
And we don't see that. We'll use some salt, a little bit of salt.
That will help as well, yes. But just raw meat that's been dried out, left out on its own, will disintegrate with time. It will start to rot. But if you soak it in tallow, it won't. So if you can imagine beef jerky pate, that's about what we're dealing with here. It has a consistency of fudge or something like that. Mm-hmm. Of course, other high meat foods include things like summer sausage. It's about 80% by calories, or hard salamis, or the non-refrigerated forms of Italian sausages tend to be very high in fat.
That's why they can be not refrigerated.
That's right.
Now, practical purposes for somebody who is interested in switching to a ketogenic diet, at what point does it become, what are the do's and don'ts? What do you see people, do you have?
Well, the number one, and I tell people to go with depending on what you're being treated for. If you're with someone with schizophrenia, if they go off the diet, you can tell right away. And it doesn't take a whole lot to take someone off the diet. I mean, a piece of candy can cause an episode. So most of my experience with it has been with autistic children, and their parents tell me that they have to maintain a high level of ketosis to keep any remissions from to keep the brain worms down.
Now, based on your comparison with what early humans might have done or what primates do in the natural world, you brought up the fact that carbohydrate harvests tend to be seasonal. You have your fruit come in season, and everybody eats fresh fruit, and then it's gone, and then you move on to other foods. Do we need some carbohydrates? Do we need these periods of carbohydrate-rich foods in our diets?
No. In fact, there are several cultures that do without any kind of vegetable material in their diets at all. The Inuit never eat vegetables, maybe one handful of berries once a year. Or you look at people like the Tutsis in Africa, the Maasai, the Sambora. They're a traditional cattle culture, and they don't eat vegetables. Their entire diet consists of meat, fat, milk, and blood. And that's all they ever eat. Of course, they have the lowest heart disease. Their diet is 65% saturated fat by calories, which of course leads to the fact that they have the lowest heart disease rates of any people ever studied. They also have extremely long lifespans and have a very low body weight. They average under 10% body fat for males and under 15% body fat for females.
Now, are you familiar with Colin Campbell's work on, I guess the popular write-up of it is a book called The China Study, but basically it was
Yes, it's been cited many times for its inaccuracies. China has some of the highest cancer rates in the world. It's really quite amazing. I don't know where he draws. His conclusions have been questioned by anyone who with half a sense of what he was If you actually go and look at the data, it doesn't present the way his book does. In fact, it turns out from studies in India, we have found out that, and study of Hindu Americans as well, is that the biggest risk known for heart disease is being vegetarian. Now, vegetarians have typically a 1.5 times risk of heart disease versus omnivores. And this is based on studies of Hindus and Muslims that live next door to each other in the same place. And the ones that don't eat meat have considerably higher heart disease, which is not surprising when you look at the cultural reasons. I don't know if you're familiar with Marvin Harris or what they call social biology, but the very reason that we invented vegetarian diets was the population of India got to the point where they could no longer support older, unproductive people. And by becoming vegetarian, they lopped off 1/3 of average lifespan and eliminated the problem. So, that allowed much higher population densities like we see there today.
Tell me again, who has published this?
Marvin Harris is the founder of this particular way of looking at anthropology. He's very well known. He wrote Cows, Pigs, Wars, and Witches. That's probably his most popular book. He also wrote a book called Good to Eat, one called Why Nothing Works. He's a very popular artist, although he's a very popular author with just average people. He wrote popular books about anthropology, but he's also very widely respected in the world of anthropology, having been the first to really apply the economics of social biology to anthropological studies.
So going back to the practical steps, if somebody's been eating a standard American diet and there's cereal with sugar and milk for breakfast, and all the nice things that we stuff ourselves with in a fast food society, and they decide, hey, I want to try this ketogenic diet. What can they expect in their first, is it something you gradually ease into? Is it something you...
Well, you can go into it any number of ways, but even if you don't go immediately as strong as you can on it, you will notice a difference. One of the reasons I got into studying this was that people started talking to me about having gone on the Neanderthin diet, how their mental clarity improved so much. And Neanderthin is probably the most ketogenic of the paleo diet books out there. A lot of other people allow things like sweet potatoes. Some people even encourage brown rice and then call it paleo. Mine is a very strict version of paleo. I call it Old Testament paleo. No fruit of the tree of knowledge. It's very Old Testament in that way, in that if it requires technology, technology being tree of knowledge in Greek, if it requires technology to be edible, I don't eat it. So I never would have something like brown rice or the starchy yams or the starchy sweet potatoes, and I very rarely even eat anything like squash, so I'm very concerned about keeping my carbohydrate levels low. But again, people started talking to me about this, and almost immediately I started getting letters from people with autistic children who had shown positive results. And that's what led me to start looking into this whole issue of ketosis.
So you started writing about it primarily related to weight loss. Is that correct?
No, I started, actually 30 years ago, I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, adult onset diabetes. And a dozen years before that, I had been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. And when I was diagnosed with the diabetes, I thought to myself, oh, yet another disease that they don't have a cure for. I can treat the symptoms, but I can't get rid of it. It's going to keep bothering me for the rest of my life. So I knew that my diabetes had come from my maternal grandfather, and that he had some Native American blood, and I knew Native Americans had very high diabetic rates as well. And I thought to myself, well, their diet was probably more natural than mine. And then I thought back to my days as a philosophy student and instructors writing define your terms on every one of my term papers. And so I said, well, nature is the absence of technology. And absent technology, I'm naked with a sharp stick. What can I eat in those circumstances? So that would determine what I would put in my plate, what I would put in my shopping cart. And I started eating this way. I gave up because it was obvious that without technology, grains, beans, potatoes, milk, and sugar were not edible to primates. So I stopped eating those. And within a couple of days, my blood sugar went normal. Within a week, all the symptoms of my arthritis went away and stayed away. And this kept on. I mean, it just stayed constant. There was no problem anymore. And people would observe me eating and then ask me why I ate so funny, and I would tell them, and they would say, well, Ray, you're crazy, and you're going to kill yourself doing that. So I started going to medical libraries. Now, it's not a very well-known fact, but every medical library in the United States is a public library. Because they receive federal funds, it's part of the funding is that they have to allow the general public in. And they actually like people who aren't doctors there. It's quite amazing. But I started going to medical libraries and finding articles about body fat and eating fat and heart disease and cancer. And I just kept doing this. And then I would throw these papers in these people's faces and then take another copy and throw it in a basket. And after 10 years, I had a basket full of papers about nutrition and Paleolithic nutrition in particular. At that point, my then wife told me she was going to have a baby, and I said, well, if you're going to have a baby, I'm going to quit my job and write my book. The first thing I learned was never say that to a pregnant woman. But I took 100 hours off and wrote a book, and this was Neanderthin, and I just started printing it up, and I ended up printing 10,000 copies in 3 editions in my spare bedroom, and that's how Neanderthin started. Of course, eventually New York heard about this after I'd sold 10,000, and St. Martin's Press came along and put out a hardcover edition and a mass market paperback, and now it's on Kindle. 20 years later, I'm still getting a monthly check from 100 hours of effort. It's quite the thing. But I've established a habit of researching, and now that the internet's out there, all of this material is available to anyone without even leaving their home. So I think that the world has come along to where, well, there are now 1,200 paleo diet books. I'm not the only one anymore. And I think a large part of that is because people can now actually go and read the original research and start to get better information about nutrition. They don't have to depend on John Harvey Kellogg, some quack doctor from the 19th century.
So diabetes is a huge issue here in New Mexico. I've heard that we're a majority-minority state, largely Hispanic Native American, and I'm told that that demographic in New Mexico has, by some estimates, 90% diabetes.
Yes, anybody who's Native American has about a 90% diabetic rate. They also have very rates of alcoholism. Of course.
Right. So what do you see? Do you see anything about alcoholism related to the ketogenic diet? And what are you seeing with diabetes in the medical literature?
Well, alcoholism is a form of carbohydrate craving, and they've been using low-carbohydrate diets to treat it for decades. It does reduce the cravings for alcohol when you stop eating high carbohydrates. You'll notice that if you go to an AA meeting, there's all kinds of sweets there. Because when it comes right down to it, alcoholism is a form of carbohydrate craving. And of course, a lot of alcoholics are self-medicating because of brain issues like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and of course they're self-medicating to try to get rid of, to tamp down those symptoms. And of course when you go to a ketogenic diet, those problems go away as well.
So did you see changes in your diabetes when you started eating?
Yes, my blood sugar went normal 24/7 within 48 hours. And it's been that way ever since. And I've received hundreds of letters from similar people. If you have type 2 diabetes, and Dr. Bernstein, I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Bernstein, he wrote Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes Solution. He was a developer of the electronic blood glucometer. He developed the meters that you see advertised on TV to test blood sugar. So consequentially, he was one of the first people to test his blood sugar several times a day. And he noticed that if he gave up carbohydrates, his blood sugar stayed a lot more normal. According to Dr. Bernstein, if you go onto a low-carbohydrate Paleolithic diet, such as the one that I espouse in Neanderthin, you should eliminate any medication requirements in type 2 diabetics. And type 1 diabetics will require 80% less insulin. So yes, if you're diabetic and you're not on a low carbohydrate diet, you're missing the boat. But of course, it's hard to get this kind of advice from doctors. The American Diabetes Society is not recommending a low carbohydrate diet, although many people think they should, but there are disincentives for them to do so. A type 2 diabetic, for instance, represents $5,000 a year in revenue. If he stops eating bread and sugar, that's a boat payment for some doctor.
We could get off on a whole different thread there. But We probably want to avoid that at this point in time.
Well, when you look at the fact that, autoimmune disorders, and in a way, well, diabetes is considered an autoimmune disorder. The body is damaging itself. Autoimmune disorders don't exist in nature. Wild animals don't get those things. Evolutionarily, they should not exist. They should have died out millions and millions of years ago. But we do find high levels of autoimmune disorders, and we're talking 95% of humans in the United States die of an autoimmune disorder. And among humans, and also among our domestic animals, like our dogs and our cats. Dogs have 4 times the cancer rates of human beings in the United States. 4 times. And it's not surprising when you look at what we feed them. We give them dry kibble, that crunchy, dry dog food. The crunchy part of complex carbohydrates is a substance called acrylamide. Several years ago, they drew blood samples from several thousand people in Denmark looking for carcinogens in the blood. And they found the most common carcinogen in the blood is acrylamide. So, of course, then they went looking for acrylamides in the environment. They found that a slice of white bread is 300 times more carcinogenic than they allow drinking water to be. That means it has an Ames number. Ames is a scale they use to determine how cancer-causing a substance is. It has an Ames number of 300. That's a white bread. Now, whole wheat, being somewhat crunchier, has an Ames number of 450. A full serving of a McDonald's French fries, where they make their money from, has an Ames number of 1100. In California a few years back, some activists tried to get them to put acrylamide levels on food packaging. Frito-Lay spent $6 million in lobbying against it. One company, $6 million in one state legislature. It's amazing. Of course, if you mention acrylamide to anyone at the Frito-Lay lab, which is here in Dallas, and my son went to school with a couple of their scientists' children. If you say the word acrylamide to a Frito-Lay scientist, they blanch white.
Now, when you're giving these values for example, the Ames numbers for McDonald's French fries, the Ames test, basically you feed the strains of bacteria some kind of mutagen, and you look at how many reversions or incidences of mutation are observed in the colony. What are they feeding whole French fries to the bacterial
they're just saying, this is based on the acrylamide level.
Okay.
Now, if you want to go to human testing, one of the first, well, you remember a guy named Napoleon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Napoleon set up this complicated system of reporting back to Paris everything that was going on in the empire, including cancer rates and per capita grain consumption. In 1843, a French doctor discovered that the number that correlated most exactly with cancer rates was per capita grain consumption. Indeed, if you knew the per capita grain consumption of a people, you could predict the cancer rates with a surprising accuracy. That's because in the process of making grain edible, you produce acrylamide. Acrylamide occurs anytime you heat a starch past 140 degrees Celsius. Okay, so anytime you cook it enough to make it edible, you're making acrylamide.
So how much plant material do you eat? I mean, what about fiber?
Well, the main reason that you need fiber is to produce a substrate for bacteria to live on, to digest the plant material you're eating. So I don't require a lot of fiber in my diet. But I do eat nuts, and I do have a salad once a day. I have a salad. Of course, I put avocado in my salad, a lot of avocado, a little bit of tomatoes, and celery and cucumber, and maybe some lettuce or cabbage. Just. But that's once a day thing for me. I start every day with a pound of bacon. I usually have anywhere from a pound to a pound and a half of steak for dinner every night. Lunch would be a couple of sausages. Now I might eat an occasional piece of fruit. I snack on nuts constantly. But I don't know that I'm in ketosis all the time, but I know that every night I dip into very deep ketosis.
Fascinating. There are so many things that you bring up that just fly in the face of conventional thought on nutrition and diet and health. And yet it does seem like there's a growing stream of individuals that are seeing results when they switch to a more ketogenic lifestyle. What do you know about?
I think a lot of scientists are looking at the trees and ignoring the forest. Grains, beans, potatoes, milk, and sugar, grains, beans, milk, ruminant milk, and refined sugars, I should clarify that, are not edible to any species of primate without technological intervention, including humans. Now, I'm a falconer, as you can probably tell from the picture in the glove behind my head here. I'm a falconer. I've been a falconer all my life. And as a falconer, if I tried to feed my falcon something that in nature it could not eat, the federal government will come and take my bird from me. That's the law. Why should I have lower standards for myself, or my children, or my pets?
Wait, do you mean in nature we wouldn't be eating McDonald's French fries and Diet Cokes laced with artificial?
Well, without the chemistry of cooking, they're not edible to primates. You can eat raw potatoes, but only about 2% of the nutrients of a potato are available if you eat it raw. You cannot just digest starch on your own. That requires a multi-chambered stomach like a cow has, or other ruminants.
Well, you hit a nerve when you made your comment about scientists seeing the forest, seeing the trees and not the forest, and as a former scientist, that really I walked away very aware of that, very aware that we publish small pieces of the whole picture, and we missed a lot of variables in the process, and so it's really hard to take something out of the lab and make it apply in a real world setting. But it's very, it was startling to me to look back at our nutritional data when I got sick. And I had to go through a process similar to what you've described of saying, hey, how am I going to deal with this thing that there's no cure for? And you look back at all the literature and all the conflicting data and all the conflicting scientific publications that are out there on nutrition. And finally, you realize we really, almost all of the nutritional science that our current food policies are based on is coming out of work that was done after the Industrial Revolution, research that was done after the Industrial Revolution and after the decision to start applying chemicals to our food system, which of course totally transformed the dynamics of the soil and the nutrient cycling of between the soil and the plant. And so it's struck me many times that we really don't know a lot about nutrition in nature. We only know about human nutrition as it applies to human industrialized nutrition.
Right. We're only aware of the foods that we grew up with. And my attitude is, in many ways, a very simple attitude. I look at it as I only eat primate foods. My poor little monkey immune system can't handle anything else. So you've got this immune system in your body. Its whole reason for existence is to look at what comes into your body and decide, is this something I need to be concerned with? Is this something that would normally be inside my body? Now, everything that you're designed to eat is programmed into your DNA. If your immune system sees something that no other primate can eat, it's going to see it as a potential pathogen and mount an immune system response to it. And when that immune system response harms another part of your body, now you have an autoimmune disorder. 95% of Americans die of an autoimmune disorder. It's like when type 1 diabetics are children, someone gave them milk. And they had an immune system response to bovine insulin. Bovine insulin is not the same as human insulin. So the immune system in 1 in 200 children will see it as a potential pathogen and make antibodies to it. Those antibodies, in turn, through a process called molecular mimicry, will attach themselves to cells in the isle of Langham where insulin is supposed to be produced in your pancreas. And now, white blood cells come along, sensing those antibodies, and destroy those cells. Now you can no longer make insulin on your own. You're a type 1 diabetic. Or if you have rheumatoid arthritis. In my particular case, my body produces an immune system response to a particular carbohydrate found in corn. It's called the GAG. That's the abbreviation for it. And those antibodies attach to certain cells in my joints that molecularly are very similar to this carbohydrate. And now my white blood cells come and destroy those joints. That's called rheumatoid arthritis. It followed corn everywhere in the world. Indeed, if I eat one corn chip tonight, my knees will hurt tomorrow, 30 years after I gave it up. So, yeah, it's a way of looking at it more than anything else. It's looking at, it's acting as a zoologist, if you will. Here's a human being, what's he designed to eat? Just like if you got an animal in the zoo, you would say to yourself, oh, here's this lizard, what should I feed it? And I look at humans the same way. What's nature is best? Nature is the absence of technology. Absent technology, I'm naked with a sharp stick. What can I eat? You'll notice on the cover of my book here that I have a picture of me naked with a sharp stick, and that's the reason why. And my vanity, of course.
Well, we'll stop with that. Ray, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure to be here, and any excuse to get Suzanne in my house is always welcome.
Thanks for hosting.
Your book is still available?
My book is available. You can buy new copies, new copies on Amazon. It's been out of print for a while. But it's also available as a Kindle. You can read it on Kindle, on your smartphone, on your computer, on your bathtub. I don't know what you have. Some refrigerators get Kindle. I don't know. But it's available on Kindle.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today, and we'll stop there.
Thank you very much.